Welcome everyone to today's vlog on contributions of early motor deficits in predicting language outcomes among preschoolers with developmental language disorder. I'm going to introduce you, well actually I'll ask Leah to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your paper. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Leah Sack. I am a PhD student at the University of Texas at Dallas in the United States, and I'm studying under the mentorship of Lisa Goffman in the Language and Motion Lab. And in our lab, we study children with developmental language disorder, DLD, and also speech sound disorder. And really what we focus on is the interactivity among the language and speech and motor and cognitive domains, particularly interested in trying to understand the extent to which the many different kinds of difficulties that children with DLD experience beyond just language. So for example, in phonological organization or even rhythm and music abilities or fine and gross motor skills, the extent to which those might actually be connected to each other and a part of the profile of DLD versus the extent to which they may simply be fairly randomly comorbid with DLD. And I'm particularly interested in understanding the cognitive mechanisms that might underlie language impairment and could connect these deficits. And so the particular article that we're talking about today, I did just want to mention that it was supported by the National Institutes of Health on an R01 that was awarded to my mentor, Lisa Goffman. And the paper is co-written by myself, Dr. Goffman, and Dr. Christine Dallahan. So in this paper, we wrote up data from a longitudinal study that Dr. Goffman had conducted while she was at Purdue University before she came over to UTD. And typically developing children and children with DLD entered this longitudinal study as 4 to 5-year-olds, and they returned annually twice more. So they completed the study when they were in early school years, 6 or 7 years of age. So it was a 2-year, 3-time point longitudinal study. And they participated in a variety of experimental tasks that looked at language and speech and manual production. And they also completed a very large battery of standardized assessments of cognition and language and speech and fine and gross motor skill. And so for this article, we were looking at only a subset of all of those tasks and assessments, and really asking, to what extent do early measures of language, speech, and motor predict later language outcome? So in the preschool years, how do you know which kids with DLD are actually going to go on to still have DLD or still have difficulty with language once they get to early school years? So the predictors that we used in that year 1 time point in preschool were standardized scores from, for example, in the language domain, the SPELT, or the Structured Photographic Expressive Language Test, which was looking at grammatical language use. In speech, the BB-TOP, or the Bengtson-Bernthal Test of Phonology, so that's a single word articulation test. And then for fine and gross motor, that predictor was based on scores from the Movement Assessment Battery for Children, or the MABC, in which the child completes a lot of fun tasks of manual dexterity and balance and aiming and catching. And then our outcome measure was the standardized language assessment at the year 3 time point, so the 6 to 7-year-olds. We had 14 children with typical development and 12 children with DLD who participated.
So Leah, I love the interactions that you're talking about, because one of the issues I've always had previously clinically was that we looked at language in isolation. And I was saying to you before we started recording that one of my loves is multidisciplinary teamwork around DLD, and that there's so much overlap in what's happening for these young people. Can you talk us through some of your key findings from the paper?
Yes, absolutely. And I agree. I think it's so important to consider the whole child and not just look at these siloed pieces. So I was saying before too, I admire how the effort that you make to be multidisciplinary. It is hard because you only have limited time as a clinician, of course. So it's hard to look at everything that might be important. So, but yeah, so our findings were super interesting. They surprised us a little bit. But the key takeaways were that among the preschoolers who had been identified as having DLD as, 4 to 5-year-olds, it was actually the fine and gross motor deficits, so not the language and not the speech scores, that predicted persistent language impairment 2 years later. And so really, preschool language ability alone wasn't a significant predictor of later school age language ability. By contrast, though, for the children with typical development, it was only the language scores at year 1 that predicted language outcome scores at year 3. So neither speech or fine and gross motor predicted language outcome for children with typical development. So it's interesting that it was sort of interacting differently, whether you had a child with DLD versus in the typical group. But really the key here is that for children with DLD, it was motor that predicted language outcome. And for typicals, it was that language to language relationship still.
Really interesting. I think about how much we rely on movement to interact in the world around us, from crawling to walking to running, and then being able to interact with and building some of that vocabulary. I can't wait to hear where you guys are going to go with some of your future research. I'd love to know, do you have any key messages? We've got a lot of clinicians and families who listen into us at the DLD project. Any key messages for them from your findings?
Yeah, so, this was a small longitudinal study that showed really children with preschool children with DLD who also had weaknesses in fine and gross motor are more likely to have persistent language deficit than those preschoolers who only had language deficits alone. And so I think it really taps into the complex profile of DLD and highlights this interactivity among all these domains. And again, just highlights how important it is to consider the whole child. And if you have the resources and the time to really get to know as many aspects of the child as you can, really know what their whole profile looks like, because it can be helpful in, well, first of all, you can identify motor deficits earlier than you can identify overt grammatical deficits. So it might allow a window into earlier intervention. And also just gives you one more data point to be able to predict what the trajectory of this child might look like and what sorts of resources may be more or less helpful for them. And in the long term, we hope that this will lead to avenues for shaping intervention. If we can really understand what is underlying the language deficit, if it's actually originating in some sort of cognitive, pattern learning or sequential processing deficit, and that's what's contributing to specific kinds of motor deficits and specific kinds of language deficits and specific kinds of, phonological organization deficits. We hope that can lead to really effective treatment and intervention strategies. So, yeah.
I love that we're starting to think beyond just the language profiles into function. What does it look like day to day? And, often it extends beyond their ability to understand and use language into other domains. So fantastic. Leah, is there anything else you'd like to add just before we wrap up today?
I did want to talk about in the article, and as I've said, the speech sound deficits didn't predict language at all. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. Because so often the children in preschool that we see with DLD, in many of our studies that we do, like 80% of these children also have speech sound deficits in those early years. But the speech deficits weren't correlated with that longer term language outcome in this longitudinal study. And so I think it's important to note here that we used just a single word articulation test, and that might be showing that that's not really what's important about DLD. And instead, it's those more complex tasks that I was sort of alluding to earlier, that require this sequential processing, like organizing phonological sequences, that is more a part of DLD and more important to DLD than perhaps single word articulation. And so one thing that we're really interested in our lab is variability and systematicity. And this might be a way to tap into that in a way that single word production or single word articulation tasks don't. So for example, the DEEP, we sometimes use here the diagnostic evaluation of articulation and phonology, measures you administer the word 3 different times, and you can look at how consistent you are with that production. And so what children with DLD might struggle with is that stability of the production, as opposed to one snapshot of being able to have that sound in their inventory versus consistently organizing it in the correct way. So, you know, boiling down to variability and systematicity and organizing complex sequences is I think what, you know, could be a really important part of an underlying mechanism in DLD.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing about your paper. I think it's been really illuminating to start to think about, you know, these different facets, and hopefully give some of our, you know, people listening in at the DLD project some thoughts and things to think about with their young person or the people they're working with. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you.